welcome back. Tonight, we're settling into one of the most tragic and pivotal moments in the Five Nights at Freddy's universe, the missing children incident. 5 young lives cut short on a summer evening in 1985. Their futures stolen in the back room of a family pizzeria. Their souls bound to metal and machinery in ways that would echo through decades. This is a story of innocence betrayed, of a predator in a yellow rabbit suit, of spirits refusing to rest, and of how a single night of horror became the foundation for everything that followed in this haunted chronicle. Before we begin our journey into these shadowed halls, feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoy this kind of slow, immersive storytelling that unfolds like a dream. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what draws you to these darker corners of gaming lore. Whether you're here to understand the full picture for the first time, to let familiar details wash over you as you drift towards sleep, or simply to spend time in this peculiar world where childhood joy and nightmare coexist, this exploration will carry you through every detail, every implication, every quiet horror of what happened on June 26, 1985. The year 1985 sits in a particular pocket of American culture. The mid-80s, when arcade cabinets still glowed in darkened rooms, when children's entertainment centers thrived on the promise of pizza and prizes, when animatronic performers represented the cutting edge of family fun. This was the world of Showbiz Pizza Place and Chuck E. Cheese, establishments where mechanical bears and rabbits sang songs and served cake to rooms full of delighted children. Fazbear Entertainment existed in this landscape, a company built on similar dreams, but destined for much darker realities. Hurricane, Utah, served as the backdrop for our story, a small town where everyone knew everyone, where local businesses formed the heart of community life, where a pizzeria could become a gathering place for birthday parties and weekend celebrations. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza had established itself as precisely such a place, building on the foundation laid by its predecessor, Fredbear's Family Diner, which had closed following its own tragedies. The restaurant represented hope for a fresh start, a chance to bring joy back to children's entertainment in a town that had seen too much sorrow. But beneath the cheerful facade, beneath the colorful decorations and the promise of fun, something malevolent stirred. Co-founder William Afton had already crossed lines that could never be uncrossed. His first victim, Charlotte Emily, daughter of his business partner Henry, had died outside Fredbear's Family Diner in 1983. Her small body left in the rain, while the security puppet struggled to reach her. That murder had awakened something in Afton, a realization that death need not be final, that spirits could linger, that machinery could house more than circuits and servos. The missing children incident would not be a sudden explosion of violence, but a calculated series of actions, methodically planned and coldly executed. It would take place during normal business hours, in a restaurant full of people, and with cameras rolling and staff nearby. The audacity of it, the sheer brazenness required to lure children away one by one while their families waited just rooms away, speaks to Afton's confidence, his understanding of human psychology, and his utter lack of empathy for the lives he was about to destroy. This incident would become the cornerstone of everything that followed. The possessions that plagued Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, the aggressive behavior of animatronics after dark, the closure of location after location, the desperate attempts to contain spirits that refused to move on, all of it traced back to what happened on that June evening. 5 children entered a back room and never emerged. 5 families were shattered. 5 souls were bound to metal shells. and one man walked away, and convinced for a time that he had gotten away with murder. Understanding the missing children incident means understanding how tragedy compounds, how a moment of violence ripples outward through time, touching lives and shaping events years and decades later. It means examining not just the act itself, but its context, its aftermath, and its implications. It means looking at the intersection of technology and the supernatural, at what happens when innovation becomes a prison for the dead, at how the pursuit of immortality, through any means, can corrupt absolutely. As we move through this exploration, we'll trace the events chronologically, while also examining them thematically, looking at the victims as individuals rather than statistics, understanding Afton's methods and motivations, witnessing the investigation and its failures, and following the consequences as they spread like cracks through glass, eventually shattering everything Fazbear Entertainment had built. We'll see how 5 deaths became a haunting, how a haunting became an obsession, and how that obsession would consume everyone it touched. The story of the missing children incident is ultimately about children and the adults who failed them. It's about trust betrayed, about the monsters that hide in plain sight, about the thin line between entertainment and horror, and about the price of unchecked ambition and unexamined evil. It's about 5 young people who went to a pizzeria for cake and games and never came home, and about the supernatural justice they would eventually exact on the man who took everything from them. So let's begin at the beginning, at the location where it all unfolded, our family restaurant that promised joy but delivered something far different. Let's step through the doors of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza as it existed in the summer of 1985, before the incident, when it still held the possibility of being what it pretended to be, a place where families made happy memories. Let's understand the stage before we examine what happened on it, the ordinary world before extraordinary horror intruded, the light before the darkness fell. The location, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, in 1985, occupied a mid-sized building in Hurricane, Utah. Its exterior promising fun through bright colors and friendly signage featuring the restaurant's mascots. The parking lot would fill with vehicles during peak hours, families arriving for birthday celebrations, casual diners dropping in for pizza and entertainment, and children pressing faces against windows to glimpse the animatronic performers visible from outside. This was a business in its prime, successful enough to draw crowds, established enough to have become a community fixture, familiar enough that parents felt comfortable leaving their children to explore while they chatted over slices. Walking through the main entrance, visitors entered a lobby area where party reservations were handled, where arcade tokens could be purchased, where the sounds of children's laughter mixed with electronic game music and animatronic performance melodies. The walls displayed posters featuring Freddy Fazbear and his band, promotional materials promising the best pizza in town, safety rules that most people glanced at, but few read carefully. At prize counters held cheap toys and candy that seemed magnificent to young eyes. The smell of baking pizza, the visual chaos of competing colors and lights, the ambient noise of entertainment all combined to create sensory overload in the best possible way for children. The main dining area spread out in a large open space, tables and chairs arranged to accommodate both small family groups and larger birthday parties. At the far end stood the stage, raised platform where the animatronic band performed. Freddy Fazbear commanded center position, a brown bear in a black top hat and bow tie, holding a microphone, his friendly smile permanently fixed. To his left stood Bonnie the Bunny, guitar held at the ready, purple fur and red bow tie giving him a distinctive appearance. To Freddy's right, Chica the Chicken held a cupcake, her yellow feathers and bib reading "Let's Eat," making her impossible to miss. And tucked away behind a curtain in Pirate's Cove, Foxy, the pirate fox, waited for his moment to perform, his out-of-order sign suggesting he was under repair, but adding to his mystique among the children who adored him. These animatronics represented substantial investment and technological achievement for their time. They moved, they sang, they interacted with audiences in scripted ways that delighted children too young to see the limitations of their programming. During performances, they would come alive, moving in synchronized patterns, voices blending in songs that had become familiar favorites. The shows ran on schedules throughout the day, entertainment provided without the unpredictability of human performers, consistent and reliable, or so they seemed before everything went wrong. Behind the main dining area lay auxiliary spaces, restrooms, kitchen facilities where staff prepared food, storage areas for supplies and equipment, and importantly, party rooms where birthday celebrations could be held in semi-private spaces, smaller areas themed around the characters where families could gather without the noise and chaos of the main room. These party rooms had doors that could close, creating the illusion of privacy while still being nominally supervised by passing staff. They were meant to be special spaces, places where birthday children felt like the center of attention, surrounded by decorations featuring their favorite animatronic characters. The restaurant also contained numerous arcade games scattered throughout, machines featuring popular titles of the era, games that ate quarters and provided minutes of entertainment, compelling enough to draw children away from tables to try just one more time to beat a high score. These games served multiple purposes, generating additional revenue, keeping children occupied while families finished meals, and creating the impression of abundant entertainment value. The electronic sounds of these games formed a constant backdrop, mixing with music from the stage and conversation from diners into a unique acoustic environment that parents learned to tune out, but children found thrilling. Security cameras monitored the restaurant, though their coverage was imperfect. Black and white feeds captured main areas, recording to tape systems that preserved footage for limited periods. These cameras were meant to protect against theft and to provide evidence if disputes arose, to let management monitor operations remotely. They would prove crucial in the investigation of the missing children incident, though their limitations would also become apparent. Not every corner was visible, not every angle was covered. And in 1985, image quality and frame rates meant that careful attention to timing could allow someone to move through blind spots with relative confidence if they knew where the cameras were positioned. But the most significant feature of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, from the perspective of what was to come, was the safe room. This was the space that existed in the building, but not on official floor plans provided to authorities, not visible to security systems, sealed behind walls that made it nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. And the safe room served as emergency storage for the older Springlock suits, Spring Bonnie and Fredbear, animatronic costumes that could be worn by employees but were extremely dangerous due to their internal mechanisms. After multiple Springlock failures at a sister location, these suits had been retired from use but not destroyed, stored away in this hidden room, along with various spare parts and older equipment. The safe room's existence reflected Fazbear Entertainment's habit of cutting corners and avoiding proper procedures. Rather than properly document and dispose of hazardous equipment, they simply sealed it away, out of sight and mind. This room was off the cameras, not accessible through normal navigation. A dead zone in the restaurant's geography that employees knew about, but few had reason to enter. The seal wasn't perfect, though. Someone who knew where to look, who had access to keys or knowledge of hidden entrances, could still get in. And William Afton certainly knew where to look. The atmosphere of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza in 1985 was one of controlled chaos. During peak hours, the restaurant buzzed with activity, staff rushing to serve tables, children running between arcade games and stage shows, parents attempting to corral their offspring for cake-cutting ceremonies. The lighting was bright, almost aggressive, designed to energize rather than relax. Everything was too loud, too colorful, too much, exactly what appealed to children whose idea of a good time involved maximal stimulation and sugar. For staff, working at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza meant long shifts dealing with demanding customers, cleaning up messes, and managing birthday party schedules, and attempting to maintain order in an environment designed to excite children into frenzy. The pay wasn't exceptional, but jobs were jobs, and in a small town like Hurricane, options were limited. Some employees took pride in their work, genuine in their desire to make children happy. Others simply endured their shifts, counting down hours until they could leave. And one employee, William Afton, used his position for purposes far darker than anyone suspected. The physical layout of the restaurant would prove crucial in understanding how the missing children incident unfolded. The party rooms provided spaces where children could be isolated from main foot traffic. The safe room offered a location completely hidden from surveillance. The arcade games scattered throughout created opportunities for children to wander, separating from their groups without immediately raising alarms. The normal chaos of a busy restaurant meant that children moving around wasn't inherently suspicious. Parents expected kids to explore, to run off to play games, to want to see animatronics up close. This expectation would be weaponized with devastating effectiveness. The restaurant's success created its own vulnerabilities. The more popular Freddy Fazbear's Pizza became, the more crowded it got, and the harder it was for individual families to keep track of their children in the press of bodies and noise. Staff were stretched thin, unable to monitor every child, focused on their specific duties rather than general supervision. The assumption was that children were safe in this environment, and that the building itself was a contained space, where the worst that could happen was a skinned knee or a minor dispute over a toy. No one imagined that within their cheerful walls, a predator was selecting victims, planning methodology, preparing to do the unthinkable. Understanding Freddy Fazbear's Pizza as it existed before the incident means recognizing it as a real place where real people worked and real families came to celebrate. It wasn't a house of horrors in appearance. It was ordinary, even mundane, distinguished from countless other family restaurants only by its specific branding and animatronic entertainment. The tragedy of what happened there stems partly from this ordinariness, from the fact that it could have been anywhere, that the setting offered no warning of what was to come. At that familiarity bred the kind of casual trust that predators depend on. The restaurant's normality also meant that its eventual closure and the revelations about what had happened there would shock the community profoundly. This wasn't some obviously dangerous location. It was where they had taken their own children, where they had laughed and eaten and celebrated birthdays. The realization that such horror had occurred in a place they considered safe would haunt Hurricane for years, creating a sense that nowhere could truly be trusted, that evil could hide anywhere, that the familiar could become deadly without warning. As we prepare to introduce William Afton properly, to examine the man who had transformed this ordinary restaurant into a crime scene, it's important to hold in mind what Freddy Fazbear's Pizza was supposed to be: a place of joy, a place of celebration, a place where childhood memories were made. The perversion of that purpose, the corruption of something meant to bring happiness into a location where children died in terror, adds an extra dimension of horror to what unfolded. It wasn't just murder. It was the desecration of innocence itself, carried out in a space designed to celebrate childhood. William Afton, the man behind the mask. William Afton's name would become synonymous with the horrors that plagued Fazbear Entertainment, but in 1985, he was simply one of the company's co-founders, a businessman known in Hurricane for his role in creating local entertainment. Understanding how a man could lure children to their deaths requires examining not just his actions, but his psychology, his history, and the gradual corruption that led him to commit unspeakable acts. Afton's partnership with Henry Emily formed the foundation of Fazbear Entertainment. Henry brought the creative vision, the engineering brilliance, the genuine love of bringing joy to children through mechanical marvels. Afton handled the business side, finances and management, tasks that required a different skill set than Henry's inventiveness. On paper, they complemented each other perfectly. In practice, their relationship was more complicated, marked by Afton's growing resentment of Henry's stable family life, his creative recognition, his ability to find fulfillment in their shared work. Where Henry saw animatronics as ways to entertain and delight, Afton saw them as tools, as means to ends that grew darker as his obsessions deepened. His interest in the technology was clinical rather than whimsical. He wanted to understand how mechanisms worked not to improve performances, but to exploit capabilities in ways Henry never intended. The Springlock suits particularly fascinated him. These hybrid devices that blurred the line between human and machine, that allowed a person to inhabit an animatronic shell and operate as both costume and autonomous performer. The danger inherent in their design, the way internal mechanisms could catastrophically fail and crush the wearer, seemed to add to their appeal for Afton, rather than inspiring appropriate caution. Afton's first murder occurred in 1983, outside Fredbear's family diner on Halloween night. Charlotte Emily, Henry's daughter, was locked outside the restaurant while a party continued inside. Afton, seeing an opportunity born perhaps from jealousy of Henry's seemingly perfect life, killed the child and drove away, leaving her body in the rain. The security puppet, programmed to protect Charlotte through a bracelet she wore, broke free of its containment when it sensed she had left its protected zone, crawling through the downpour until it found her corpse. The puppet collapsed there, circuits failing from water damage, and in that moment, Charlotte's spirit possessed the animatronic, marking the first time a human soul merged with machinery. The evidence suggests this possession fascinated Afton once he became aware of it. Based on his later actions, we can infer he had killed Charlotte in a moment of rage or jealousy or simple cruelty, but the result was something he hadn't anticipated. Charlotte lived on in some form. Her consciousness, her awareness, her very essence remained bound to the puppet. This shouldn't have been possible according to conventional understanding. Death was supposed to be final. Yet here was evidence that spirits could linger, that the boundary between life and death was more permeable than anyone realized, implying that perhaps mortality itself could be overcome through the right applications of technology and circumstances. Afton's own family life was complicated and would grow more tragic. He had 3 children. Michael, the eldest, who bullied his younger brother relentlessly. Elizabeth, his daughter, who would die in 1983 when Circus Baby's claw mechanism pulled her inside the animatronic's body cavity. And the youngest son, often called the crying child in the fandom, who died from head injuries after Michael and his friends shoved his head into Fredbear's mouth as a cruel prank, triggering the Springlock mechanisms that crushed his skull. These family tragedies might have devastated a normal man, might have inspired reflection and change. For Afton, they seemed to fuel his obsessions rather than temper them. The loss of his youngest son appeared to cement something in Afton's psychology. Rather than mourning in traditional ways, he became consumed with the idea of bringing the boy back, of undoing death through mechanical means. He had seen Charlotte possess the puppet. He believed he could replicate this process deliberately, could bind souls to animatronics through calculated murder rather than accident. His grief, if he felt anything resembling normal grief, transformed into scientific curiosity and the beginning of experimentation that would require more victims. Understanding Afton's motivations requires recognizing that he was simultaneously grieving father, jealous business partner, serial killer, and mad scientist. These aspects of his personality weren't separate, but intertwined, each informing and reinforcing the others. His losses made him desperate. His jealousy made him cruel. His curiosity made him ruthless. And his position within Fazbear Entertainment gave him access and opportunity to act on impulses that most people would never even conceptualize. Afton's intelligence cannot be understated. He was clever enough to co-found a successful business, talented enough with technology to understand and modify complex animatronic systems, and socially adept enough to maintain a facade of normality while planning horrors. He understood human psychology, knew how to gain trust, recognized the patterns of behavior that could be exploited. When he decided to murder 5 children at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, he didn't act impulsively. He planned. He considered timing, methodology, victim selection, disposal of evidence. He approached murder the way an engineer approaches a problem, breaking it down into components, identifying challenges, developing solutions. The Spring Bonnie suit became Afton's chosen tool because he understood its psychological power. Children had been taught to trust Fazbear Entertainment mascots. The characters were friendly, non-threatening, associated with fun and celebration. A person in a mascot costume had implicit permission to interact with children. I could approach them without immediately raising alarms, could gain trust through the character rather than through individual personality. The yellow rabbit suit provided perfect camouflage, allowing Afton to hide his identity while leveraging the social permission granted to mascot performers. His choice to carry out the murders during business hours in a location full of people demonstrated both arrogance and understanding of human behavior. Parents expected children to be safe in a controlled environment like the restaurant. Staff were focused on their duties, not on monitoring every child's movements. The general chaos and noise of a busy pizzeria meant that individual incidents could easily go unnoticed. And Afton had access to areas like the safe room that weren't on cameras, weren't regularly visited, weren't even officially acknowledged to exist. He could lure children away, murder them in this hidden space, and emerge without anyone realizing what had happened until much later, when the disappearances became impossible to ignore. Afton's lack of empathy was profound. To kill one child requires a particular kind of moral bankruptcy. To kill 5, systematically, one after another, requires something beyond normal human cruelty. He viewed his victims as means to an end, as experimental subjects in his research into possession and spirit binding, as raw materials for his attempts to understand and potentially control death itself. Their terror, their suffering, their truncated futures apparently meant nothing to him compared to the knowledge he sought to gain. The psychology of serial killers often includes elements of power and control, a desire to dominate that manifests in the ultimate expression of taking life. Afton fit this pattern while also transcending it through his technological obsessions. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted to own these children's souls, to bind them to machines, to prove his theories about possession, and demonstrate mastery over the fundamental boundary between life and death. His murders served both immediate gratification and longer-term experimental goals. After the murders, Afton's ability to maintain normalcy was chilling. He continued working at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza as though nothing had happened. He interacted with police during their investigation, answered questions, provided information, all while knowing he was responsible for 5 disappearances. When he was briefly arrested based on video surveillance evidence, and he showed no signs of guilt or anxiety, confident in his understanding that without bodies, conviction would be impossible. And he was right. Lack of physical evidence meant he was released, charges dropped or never formally filed, allowed to walk free despite being the obvious suspect. This failure of justice wasn't unique to Afton's case, but reflected broader issues with how crimes against children were investigated and prosecuted, particularly in 1985, when forensic techniques and understanding of serial killers were still developing. Afton understood these limitations and exploited them ruthlessly. He knew that disappearances without bodies presented enormous challenges for prosecutors. He knew that circumstantial evidence often wasn't enough for conviction, and he knew that if he could maintain composure and avoid making incriminating statements, the burden of proof would be difficult for investigators to meet. The aftermath of the missing children incident showed Afton at his most calculated. Rather than fleeing, rather than showing any sign of guilt, he continued his involvement with Fazbear Entertainment. He watched as the restaurant struggled with the fallout from the disappearances, as health code violations piled up due to the animatronics' increasingly bizarre malfunctions, as parents stopped bringing children to a location now associated with tragedy. He observed all of this while knowing he had caused it, while understanding that the animatronics' odd behavior stemmed from the spirits of his victims possessing their mechanical bodies. Did Afton feel anything resembling remorse? The evidence suggests not. His later actions, his continued killing, his experiments with remnant, the physical substance that binds souls to objects, his attempts to create more possessed animatronics, all point to someone completely divorced from normal human morality. If anything, the success of his initial murders in creating possessed animatronics likely reinforced his behavior, providing confirmation of his theories and motivation to continue his dark research. The character of William Afton serves as the human monster at the center of the Five Nights at Freddy's story. He's not supernatural, not a demon or ghost, but rather an ordinary man who made extraordinary choices to pursue impossible goals. This makes him more frightening in many ways than any supernatural entity could be, because he represents a real possibility, are a human being capable of profound evil, operating in plain sight, protected by social position and others' inability to imagine someone doing what he did. As we move forward to examine the specific events of June 26, 1985, it's important to remember that behind the yellow rabbit suit, behind the friendly voice and reassuring demeanor that lured children to their deaths, was William Afton, a man who had crossed every moral boundary, who had lost whatever humanity he once possessed, who saw children as experimental subjects rather than as people. Understanding him helps us understand how the missing children incident was possible, how someone could commit such acts in broad daylight, and how the failure to stop him would lead to decades of supernatural consequences. The Spring Bonnie suit. The Spring Bonnie costume that William Afton wore to commit the missing children murders represents a crucial intersection of Fazbear Entertainment's technological innovations and the vulnerabilities those innovations created. Understanding this suit, how it functioned and why Afton chose it, provides essential context for the events of June 26, 1985. Springlock suits were a proprietary technology developed by Henry Emily and William Afton in the early years of their partnership. Created when Fredbear's Family Diner was the primary location for their fledgling entertainment company. The concept was elegant in theory. Create animatronic costumes that could function in two modes. In animatronic mode, they would perform autonomously, entertaining crowds without requiring a human operator. In suit mode, and the internal animatronic endoskeleton would compress and lock into place using spring-loaded mechanisms, creating space for a human performer to wear the costume and operate it manually, allowing for more dynamic and interactive performances than the automated routines could provide. The Springlock mechanisms themselves were marvels of compact engineering, utilizing tightly wound springs to compress the animatronic components, endoskeleton limbs and other internal machinery into minimal space when wound properly. This compression created enough room inside the suit for a human body, allowing someone to slip into the costume and effectively become the character. Once worn, the suit provided full mobility, albeit somewhat restricted by the costume's bulk. A trained performer could walk, gesture, interact with guests, and all while hidden inside the character's form. Spring Bonnie was one of two Springlock suits created, the other being Fredbear. Spring Bonnie was designed as a cheerful yellow rabbit, companion to the golden bear who served as the franchise's primary mascot. The suit featured cartoonish proportions, oversized head with permanent smile, floppy ears, bow tie, and a body shape to suggest friendliness and approachability. When functioning in animatronic mode, Spring Bonnie would perform alongside Fredbear in shows that combined the automated precision of programmed movements with occasional human-operated segments for special interactions. The suit's color was significant from a practical standpoint. Bright yellow meant it was highly visible, easy to spot in crowds, which was desirable for a mascot meant to draw attention. But it also meant witnesses could easily identify when someone was wearing it, making descriptions like a yellow rabbit or someone in the Spring Bonnie costume simple and memorable. This would prove important during the investigation of the missing children incident, when multiple witnesses reported seeing a person in a yellow mascot costume near where children disappeared. Operating a Springlock suite required careful procedure and training. Before a person could safely wear the suit, they needed to wind each Springlock mechanism using a hand crank, ensuring the springs were tightly compressed and locked into place. This process took time and precision, as missing even a single lock could result in partial failure, and the consequences of failure were severe. The suits came with explicit warnings and training procedures outlined in cassette tapes provided to employees, instructions delivered in calm, measured tones that somehow made the danger they described even more unsettling. The primary danger of Springlock suits stemmed from what happened if the locks failed while someone was wearing the suit. The compressed endoskeleton components, held in place by spring tension, would suddenly release, snapping back into their operational positions with tremendous force. For a person inside the suit when this happened, the result would be catastrophic. Metal endoskeleton pieces would impale and crush the wearer from inside, organs pierced by suddenly moving components, bones shattered by the force of expanding machinery, a body cavity invaded by mechanisms designed for an animatronic frame rather than human anatomy. Moisture was the primary trigger for Springlock failures. Even small amounts of sweat or breathing condensation could cause the delicate locking mechanisms to loosen, starting a cascade failure as one release spring triggered others. This made the suits particularly dangerous in humid environments or for wearers engaged in physical activity that would cause perspiration. The training tapes warned employees to breathe carefully, minimize movement, and absolutely avoid getting the suit wet. These warnings proved tragically insufficient during a series of simultaneous Springlock failures at a sister location. Failures severe enough that Fazbear Entertainment eventually retired the suits from active use. So after the Springlock failures that led to their decommissioning, Spring Bonnie and Fredbear were sealed in safe rooms, stored away, but not destroyed. This decision reflected Fazbear Entertainment's typical approach to problems: hide them rather than properly address them. The suits represented significant investment, and destroying them would mean accepting total loss. But keeping them where they might be accessed, where an employee with knowledge of the safe room locations could potentially use them, created exactly the vulnerability that William Afton would exploit. Afton chose Spring Bonnie for several strategic reasons. First, wearing the suit provided complete physical disguise. His features were hidden inside the large costume head, his body obscured by the bulky frame, his voice muffled and distorted by the suit's construction. Witnesses could describe what they saw, but they wouldn't be able to identify him specifically. They would only know someone was wearing the Spring Bonnie costume, not who that someone was. Second, the suit carried cultural weight. Children recognized Spring Bonnie as a trusted character associated with Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and its predecessor, Fredbear's Family Diner. The mascot represented fun, safety, celebration. Children were conditioned to approach and interact with mascot characters at entertainment venues. Parents encouraged this interaction, taking photos of their children with mascots, treating these encounters as highlights of visits. The suit weaponized this conditioned trust, transforming a symbol of childhood joy into a tool for predation. Third, Afton had the knowledge and access required to use the suit. As co-founder of Fazbear Entertainment, he understood Springlock technology intimately, knew how to properly wind and wear the suit safely, had keys to the safe room where Spring Bonnie was stored. While other employees might theoretically have been able to access and use the suit, Afton's combination of knowledge, access, and willingness to take the risk made him uniquely positioned to exploit this particular method. Fourth, wearing the suit provided a kind of psychological distance from his actions. When Afton put on Spring Bonnie, he became someone else, or perhaps he became nothing, an empty space inside a costume, a persona that could do things William Afton, the businessman and father, ostensibly could not. This distancing is common in serial killers who use disguises or alternate identities, allowing them to separate their crimes from their normal life, to maintain whatever self-image they prefer, while committing acts that would otherwise shatter that image. The physical experience of wearing a Springlock suit was reportedly uncomfortable even under ideal conditions. The compressed endoskeleton created uneven pressure points inside the costume. Movement was restricted by the suit's design and the need to avoid triggering Springlock failures. Vision was limited to what could be seen through the costume's eyes, which didn't align perfectly with the wearer's sightlines. Breathing was difficult, requiring careful control to avoid moisture buildup inside the suit. Temperature regulation was poor, the costume's sealed nature trapping body heat. Yet Afton wore this suit willingly, repeatedly, accepting the discomfort and danger because it served his purposes. The irony of the Spring Bonnie suite is that it would eventually become Afton's prison and death trap. Years after the missing children incident, when Afton returned to the abandoned Freddy Fazbear's Pizza to dismantle the possessed animatronics, the spirits of his victims cornered him in the safe room. In panic, he dove into the Spring Bonnie suit, seeking protection from the ghosts. But the suit had been stored in the sealed safe room for years, exposed to moisture from leaking ceilings. As Afton laughed at the spirits, thinking himself safe inside his protective shell, the Springlocks failed catastrophically. The endoskeleton expanded, impaling him from inside, crushing organs, piercing through flesh, creating wounds that should have been immediately fatal. Yet somehow, perhaps through supernatural intervention or sheer malevolent will, Afton didn't fully die. His body merged with the suit, flesh and metal becoming one, creating the horror known as Springtrap, a walking corpse sealed inside the machine that killed it. This poetic justice, Afton destroyed by the very tool he used to commit his crimes, represents a kind of narrative symmetry. The suit that allowed him to gain children's trust and murder them in safety eventually became the mechanism of his own doom. The technology he exploited, the Springlock system he understood so well, turned against him when his knowledge failed in a moment of panic. The costume that let him hide his identity became a prison that revealed his crimes, as Springtrap's decaying corpse, visible through tears in the suit, left no doubt about who had died inside. But in 1985, on June 26th, the Spring Bonnie suit was simply a tool, a means to an end, a costume that William Afton wore to commit the worst crime of his life. Understanding the suit, its capabilities and limitations, its cultural significance and technical specifications, helps us grasp the methodology behind the murders. Afton didn't attack children as himself. He wore a mask, literal and metaphorical, transforming into something that children would approach willingly, that could operate in public spaces without raising immediate alarm, that could move through the restaurant with a kind of terrible invisibility born from seeming to belong exactly where it was. As we prepare to examine the events of June 26th in detail, keep in mind that when witnesses reported seeing a yellow rabbit, when children described someone in a costume calling to them, when security cameras captured blurry footage of a mascot figure moving through the restaurant, they were documenting William Afton in his chosen disguise, hidden inside Spring Bonnie, using technology meant to bring joy to, instead, bring unimaginable horror to 5 young lives about to be cut short. June 26th, 1985. The day everything changed. June 26, 1985 fell on a Wednesday, an ordinary summer day in Hurricane, Utah, when most children were out of school and families were looking for activities to fill long, hot afternoons. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza anticipated a busy day, with several birthday parties scheduled and regular foot traffic expected from families seeking air conditioning and entertainment. The restaurant opened normally, staff arriving for shifts, animatronics booting up for their first performances, the smell of pizza dough and tomato sauce beginning to fill the air as ovens heated and ingredients were prepared. Nothing about the morning suggested that before the day ended, 5 children would be dead and the restaurant would be marked forever as a site of tragedy. Among the scheduled events was a birthday party for a child named Gabriel Gardner, who was turning 7 years old. Gabriel's parents had reserved one of the party rooms, decorated with Freddy Fazbear-themed decorations, a cake on order, invitations sent to classmates and friends. This was meant to be Gabriel's day, a celebration where he would be the center of attention, where he could play games with friends, watch animatronic shows, and make memories of being 7 that would last into adulthood. Instead, Gabriel would become one of the missing children, and his name eventually revealed in the Lawkeeper ending of Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, his soul bound to the Freddy Fazbear animatronic, his 7th birthday marking the end rather than a milestone of his life. The other victims were Susie, Jeremy, Fritz, and Cassidy, children who came to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza that day for various reasons. Some may have been attendees at Gabriel's party. Others might have been there with their own families for unrelated celebrations or simply casual visits. What united them was presence at the wrong place and wrong time, crossing paths with William Afton when he was ready to act, becoming targets of opportunity for a predator who had prepared the ground carefully and needed only willing victims to complete his plan. And understanding the sequence of events requires piecing together evidence from multiple sources, security camera footage that would be referenced in police reports, witness statements from children and adults who saw parts of what happened without understanding the full picture, the mini-games in the 5 Nights at Freddy's games that depict moments from the incident in abstracted pixel art form, and the physical evidence that would eventually be discovered when the animatronics began to malfunction in telling ways. Afton's preparation began before the restaurant opened, or perhaps the previous night. He needed to access the safe room to retrieve the Spring Bonnie suit, wind all the Springlock mechanisms properly to ensure they wouldn't fail during his activities, and plan his timing to coincide with busy periods when his movements would be least noticed. The suit had to be stored somewhere accessible during his shift, but not where staff would stumble across it. He needed to know which areas of the restaurant were on camera, and which represented blind spots or dead zones where he could move without being recorded. The first victim, according to various interpretations of the law, was likely Susie. Her story is detailed in the Fruity Maze minigame from Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, which shows a young blonde girl playing an arcade game. The game glitches and corrupts, imagery of dead dogs appearing where fruit should be, and in the reflection of the arcade screen, we see Susie crying, with Spring Bonnie standing behind her. A text dialogue appears. "He's not really dead. He's over here. Follow me." This refers to Susie's dog, which had died recently, possibly run over by a car, possibly even by William Afton himself as a deliberate act to create vulnerability and emotional manipulation opportunity. Susie was in emotional distress over her dog's death, grief making her vulnerable to manipulation. Afton, disguised in the Spring Bonnie suit, approached with a claim designed to appeal to desperate hope. He told her that her dog wasn't dead, that he had found the dog alive, that if she followed him, he would take her to where the dog was waiting. For a child already grieving, this promise was irresistible. She followed Spring Bonnie away from the arcade area, through the restaurant, toward the back rooms where staff usually went, where children weren't supposed to be without adult supervision. The safe room was Afton's destination, the hidden space off camera where he could act without witnesses. Whether he killed Susie immediately upon entering, or whether there were moments of realization, of understanding that she had been tricked, of terror as she saw the room contain no dog and recognized too late that she was in danger, is not documented. What is certain is that Susie died in that room, murdered by the man in the Spring Bonnie suit. Evidence from Ultimate Custom Night, where Chica's voice line states, "I was the first, I have seen everything," suggests Susie may have been the first of the 5 children killed that day, though the exact sequence remains somewhat unclear. After Susie, Afton needed to be careful. One child disappearing might be explained as wandering off, getting lost, slipping out an exit. But multiple disappearances would raise alarms, trigger searches, potentially expose his actions before he could complete his plan. He had to time subsequent lures carefully, spacing them out enough that immediate connection wasn't made, choosing moments when attention was divided and chaos was highest. Jeremy was lured next, according to the progression suggested in various sources. The tall boy with dark skin and buzz-cut hair. Jeremy may have been at Gabriel's party, or simply visiting the restaurant separately. The method of his luring isn't as specifically detailed as Susie's, but the pattern would have been similar. Spring Bonnie approaching, offering something appealing or requesting help, creating a reason for the child to follow into areas where adults weren't present, and eventually leading to the safe room where Jeremy would meet the same fate as Susie. Gabriel, the birthday boy himself, was among the victims. The bitter irony of dying on what should have been the happiest day of his year, surrounded by friends and family who believed he was safe, who trusted the restaurant to protect him, who had no idea that death was moving through the building in a yellow rabbit costume. Gabriel's parents were likely nearby, chatting with other parents, watching other children, assuming Gabriel was playing games or watching animatronics. When he disappeared, they probably weren't immediately concerned, thinking he had just wandered to another part of the restaurant, that he'd return soon. Only as time passed without his return would worry begin to build, transforming gradually into panic. Fritz followed Gabriel, the boy with reddish blonde hair and freckles, wearing a striped shirt. Fritz might have been Gabriel's friend, might have been looking for him when Afton found him, or might have been an entirely separate target. By this point, Afton was committed to his course, had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, had 3 bodies hidden in the safe room, and no option except to continue forward or face immediate exposure if his crimes were discovered prematurely. Cassidy, the 5th child, remains somewhat mysterious in presentation, despite being one of the most important figures in the franchise's lore. Cassidy would eventually possess Golden Freddy, becoming the vengeful spirit who would torment Afton in Ultimate Custom Night, the child who refused to move on even when others found peace. On June 26, 1985, Cassidy was simply another child at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, another target for Afton's calculated predation, another young life ended before it truly began. The timeline of the murders likely spanned several hours. Afton couldn't have lured and killed all 5 children in quick succession without raising immediate alarms. He would have needed to return to his normal duties between murders, interact normally with other staff and guests, maintain his facade of innocent employee while hiding monstrous actions. The psychological compartmentalization required for this, the ability to switch between killer and normal person multiple times in a single day, speaks to profound dissociation or complete absence of empathy. Security cameras captured something of what happened. Footage showed a person in a mascot costume, identified as Spring Bonnie based on its yellow color and rabbit characteristics, in various locations throughout the restaurant during the time period when children disappeared. This footage would become crucial evidence during the investigation, providing the visual record that placed someone in the Spring Bonnie suit near where victims were last seen. However, the footage couldn't identify who was inside the suit. Multiple people had access to the costume theoretically. Without being able to prove Afton specifically wore it, the footage was insufficient for conviction, despite being highly suggestive of guilt. The actual methods of murder are not explicitly detailed in the games, sparing players the graphic horror while still conveying that something terrible occurred. Whether Afton used weapons, his hands, or some other means is unclear. What matters is that 5 children entered the safe room with him and never left alive. Their bodies were hidden, eventually stuffed into animatronic suits, as we'll explore in detail later. But in the moments of their deaths, they were simply children, terrified and betrayed, dying at the hands of someone they had trusted because he wore a costume that represented safety and fun. As the afternoon turned to evening, as Gabriel's party time expired and he failed to return, as other parents began to realize their children were missing, as staff started searching the restaurant systematically, the reality of what had happened began to dawn on everyone. This wasn't children wandering off. This wasn't kids hiding as a prank. 5 children were gone, simply vanished from a restaurant that should have been a controlled environment, that had limited exits, that should have made it impossible for children to disappear without someone noticing. Police were called. The restaurant was locked down. Everyone present was questioned. Security footage was reviewed. But William Afton had planned carefully. The safe room wasn't on any official floor plans provided to authorities. The bodies were hidden where cursory searches wouldn't find them. The Spring Bonnie suit was returned to its storage location, cleaned of any obvious evidence, sealed away. And Afton himself remained calm, cooperating with investigators, expressing shock and concern, performing the role of innocent employee while knowing he had committed 5 murders. June 26, 1985, ended with 5 families destroyed, a community traumatized, a restaurant that would never recover its reputation, and a murderer who believed he had gotten away with his crimes. The day marked a turning point, not just in the fictional narrative of 5 Nights at Freddy's, but in the supernatural reality of that universe, as spirits began their journey toward vengeance and possession, as the boundary between life and death became permeable, as technology and the occult merged in ways that would haunt Fazbear Entertainment for decades. The victims of that day deserved to be remembered as individuals, as children with personalities and interests and futures that were stolen from them. In the next section, we'll examine each of the 5 missing children more closely, understanding who they were beyond just names and animatronic associations, and recognizing the human cost of what William Afton did on that terrible June day, when summer sunshine outside the restaurant contrasted with the darkness unfolding within its walls. The 5 victims, Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy. 5 names that would eventually be revealed through cryptic means in the games, their graves shown on a hillside in the completion ending of Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator. Simple markers bearing their names with no dates or elaborate inscriptions. These weren't just plot devices or game mechanics. In the universe of Five Nights at Freddy's, they were children who lived and died, who had families and friends, who possessed hopes and fears and personalities that were extinguished by William Afton's actions. Understanding them as individuals rather than as a collective group of victims adds depth and tragedy to the missing children incident, reminding us that behind every statistic of violence, there are human stories cut short. Gabriel Gardner was celebrating his 7th birthday at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza on June 26, 1985. Born on June 26, 1978, he was turning 7, a milestone birthday in childhood, when kids start to develop stronger senses of self and independence. Gabriel's parents had organized the party, sent invitations, arranged for cake and pizza, done everything parents do to make their child feel special on their birthday. The party room was likely decorated in Freddy Fazbear themes, with Gabriel's favorite character represented prominently. Friends from school and neighborhood had come to celebrate with him, playing games, watching animatronic shows, enjoying the chaos and joy of a childhood birthday party. What kind of child was Gabriel? The games give us limited information, but we know he possessed enough presence of mind after death to maintain association with his name, to retain identity even while possessing the Freddy Fazbear animatronic. He was described as a young boy with pale skin and black hair, details that make him a real person rather than an abstract concept. He attended school, had parents who loved him enough to throw a proper birthday party, lived in Hurricane among a community that knew him. His disappearance wasn't just a tragedy for his immediate family, but a wound in the community fabric, a reminder that children who everyone knew by name could be taken without warning. Gabriel's possession of Freddy Fazbear creates a certain poetic horror. Freddy is the leader of the animatronic band, the face of Fazbear Entertainment, the character whose name appears in the franchise title. Gabriel, whose birthday party was meant to honor him as the center of attention, became bound to the animatronic, who was the center of every show. The possession inverted the relationship between child and entertainer. Where Freddy should have existed to bring joy to children like Gabriel, Gabriel's spirit now inhabited Freddy, transforming the entertainer into something dark and vengeful, a host for a murdered child's confused anger. Jeremy's identity is less developed in detail, but no less significant. Described as tall for his age with dark skin and a buzz-cut hairstyle, Jeremy was one of the 5 children who disappeared on June 26. The name Jeremy appears multiple times in the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise in different contexts, which has led to some confusion in the fandom. But the Jeremy of the missing children incident is specifically the child who would come to possess Bonnie the Bunny. The logbook and various other sources confirm this association, with Jeremy's grave in the completion ending positioned corresponding to Bonnie's placement in the bad ending of Five Nights at Freddy's 3. Jeremy's personality can only be inferred from limited evidence. He was young, likely elementary school aged, at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza on a day that should have been fun and ended in tragedy. His possession of Bonnie is significant because Bonnie is portrayed as Freddy's closest companion, the 2 characters often shown together in promotional materials and in-game content, paired as friends in a way that suggests Jeremy and Gabriel may have been friends in life, maintaining their bond even in death through the animatronics they inhabited. The missing children demonstrate awareness of their situation in some capacity. the week before novel establishes that the spirits remember their names, can communicate this information telepathically to living people who interact with the possessed animatronics. When security guard Ralph encounters Bonnie, the name Jeremy appears in his thoughts unbidden. This suggests Jeremy maintained enough selfhood to retain his name, to want to be known as himself rather than simply as the thing possessing Bonnie, to hold on to identity even as his spirit merged with machinery. Susie's story is the most developed of the 5 missing children. Her background explored in multiple sources, including the Fruity Maze minigame and the Coming Home story from Fazbear Frights. Susie was a young girl with blonde curly hair, described as having blue eyes and wearing a purple top with white lace. She came from a family that owned or had recently owned a dog, a pet she loved deeply. The death of this dog created a vulnerability that Afton exploited ruthlessly. Whether the dog's death was genuinely accidental, or whether Afton deliberately caused it to create this emotional opening remains unclear, though the latter would certainly align with his calculated approach to selecting and manipulating victims. The Fruity Maze minigame depicts Susie playing an arcade game, likely one of her favorite pastimes at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. As the game progresses and corrupts, dead dogs appear where fruit should be, images that reflect Susie's emotional state and recent trauma. The game screen shows Susie's reflection, her expression shifting from neutral to sad to crying as the game continues. When Spring Bonnie appears behind her in the reflection, when the text declares, "He's not really dead, he's over here, follow me," Susie's grief made her susceptible to this manipulation. Based on the evidence suggesting Susie was targeted first, Afton's choice demonstrates calculated cruelty. He identified a child in emotional distress, understood what she was grieving, and weaponized that grief to gain her trust. The promise that her dog was alive, that she could see it if she just followed, was perfectly calibrated to override any stranger danger training she might have received. She wasn't following a stranger. She was following Spring Bonnie, a character she recognized, to find her beloved pet. The betrayal, when she realized the truth, must have been devastating in the moments before her death. Susie's possession of Chica the chicken creates interesting symbolic connections. Chica is associated with food, holding a cupcake, her bib reading "Let's eat." This connection to food and consumption might reflect Susie's previous positive associations with Freddy Fazbear's Pizza as a place to eat and celebrate, now inverted into something darker. Some interpretations within the community suggest the cupcake itself might be possessed by Susie's dog, though this remains firmly in the realm of theory rather than confirmed lore. What's certain is that Chica displays particular awareness and emotion among the animatronics, as suggesting Susie maintains strong sense of self even in possession. Fritz is perhaps the least developed of the 5 missing children in terms of individual characterization. Described as having short, messy, dirty, reddish blonde hair with bangs, freckles, wearing a red and white striped t-shirt, grey shorts, and beige shoes with white socks at the time of his disappearance, Fritz was reported missing by his mother, Alyssa Thompson. He was said to be the 4th child lured away, placing his death between Gabriel's and Cassidy's in the sequence of events on June 26th. Fritz's possession of Foxy the Pirate is notable because Foxy occupies a unique position among the animatronics. Foxy is kept behind a curtain in Pirate's Cove, marked as out of order, separated from the main band, are depicted as more aggressive and less controlled in his movements. This isolation and distinct characterization might reflect something about Fritz's personality, or might simply be a function of which animatronics were available for possession when the spirits were distributed into the machines. The name Fritz appears multiple times in the franchise, including as an alias used by a night guard, which has led to some confusion about whether multiple characters share the name or if there are narrative connections between these instances. For the missing children incident specifically, Fritz refers to the child, one of 5 lives cut short, one of 5 spirits bound to machinery, one of 5 reasons why the animatronics at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza behaved with such hostility toward adult humans in the years following the murders. Cassidy stands out among the missing children for several reasons. Unlike the others who possess clear animatronic forms, Cassidy becomes associated with Golden Freddy, a ghostly, partially corporeal entity that appears and disappears, that exists somewhat outside the normal rules governing the other possessed animatronics. Golden Freddy's ambiguous nature, neither fully physical nor entirely spiritual, reflects Cassidy's unique role in the story. Cassidy is identified as one of the missing children through the logbook, where careful analysis of hidden text reveals the name through a complex puzzle involving faded text, altered letters, and questions designed to help the reader determine identity. This cryptic presentation reflects Golden Freddy's enigmatic nature, the character who requires effort to encounter, who doesn't operate according to obvious patterns, who seems to exist partially outside the normal game mechanics. The characterization of Cassidy varies across different interpretations and sources. Some evidence suggests Cassidy is female, while other sources present different information, creating ongoing debate in the fandom about this detail. What's more certain is Cassidy's role as the vengeful spirit, the one who refuses to move on even after the other missing children find peace in the Happiest Day minigame. Cassidy maintains attachment to William Afton specifically, creating ultimate custom night as an eternal torment for the man who murdered 5 children, ensuring that Afton's death doesn't bring him peace. This vengefulness distinguishes Cassidy from the other victims. While all 5 children have reason to be angry, to seek revenge, to lash out at a world that failed to protect them, only Cassidy maintains that anger beyond the point where release becomes possible. The other children are presented as wanting to move on, as trapped by circumstance rather than choice, as needing help to find peace. Cassidy actively chooses continued existence to ensure Afton suffers, prioritizing revenge over rest. Understanding why Cassidy became the particularly vengeful spirit requires speculation, as the games don't provide explicit answers. Perhaps Cassidy was the last to die, potentially experiencing the horror of knowing what had happened to the other children before dying in the same way. Perhaps Cassidy's personality was naturally more stubborn, more determined, less willing to accept injustice, and perhaps the circumstances of death or the trauma of the experience created a different kind of spiritual resonance, binding Cassidy's soul more firmly to the mortal realm and to the need for justice. The games leave this ambiguous, allowing for multiple interpretations of what made this particular spirit refuse to rest. The 5 missing children were not a monolith. They were individuals with different personalities, different backgrounds, different reasons for being at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza on June 26, 1985. Gabriel celebrating a birthday, Jeremy perhaps attending as a guest, Susie grieving a pet, Fritz and Cassidy there for reasons we can only speculate about. They didn't know each other necessarily. They might have been strangers bound together only by shared fate, by the tragic coincidence of crossing William Afton's path on the day he decided to commit multiple murders. It's worth noting that some sources suggest the possibility of a sixth victim, with evidence from Into the Pit showing 6 corpses in the recreation of the incident. An ultimate custom night, including references that could imply an additional child. However, the core narrative consistently focuses on 5 named victims, and the identity and circumstances of any potential 6th child remain subjects of ongoing debate rather than confirmed canon. Their deaths were not quick or painless, were not accidents or acts of nature. They were deliberate murders of children by an adult who used his position, his knowledge, and their trust to lure them to deaths they couldn't have anticipated or understood. And the horror of the missing children incident lies not in supernatural elements, but in this very human evil, in the fact that these deaths could have been prevented if adults had been more vigilant, if Afton had been stopped after Charlotte Emily, if the warning signs had been recognized and acted upon. But they weren't prevented. Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz and Cassidy died in that safe room, their bodies hidden in animatronic suits, their souls bound to machinery through means both technological and supernatural. They became the haunted animatronics, the possessed machines that would terrify night guards and destroy the reputation of Fazbear Entertainment, seeking vengeance on adults who resembled their killer, unable to distinguish between the guilty and the innocent, trapped in a cycle of violence and fear that would only end years later when deliberate intervention finally granted them release. Remembering them as children rather than as game mechanics or plot devices honors what their story represents. The tragedy of lives cut short, of potential unfulfilled, of families destroyed by senseless violence. 5 graves on a hillside, 5 names without dates, 5 markers for children who deserve better than what William Afton gave them on June 26, 1985. The investigation and cover-up. The disappearance of 5 children from Freddy Fazbear's Pizza on June 26, 1985, triggered an immediate investigation by local law enforcement, but the peculiar circumstances of the case, the lack of bodies, and the limitations of forensic technology in the mid-1980s combined with William Afton's careful planning to create a situation where justice would prove frustratingly elusive, despite overwhelming suspicion of who was responsible. The alarm was raised gradually, rather than all at once. Parents of children attending Gabriel's birthday party began to notice around late afternoon that Gabriel hadn't returned to the party room, that he'd been gone longer than a quick bathroom break or game session would explain. Initial searches of the party room and immediate surroundings didn't locate him. Staff were asked to check if he'd been seen in other areas. Other parents mentioned that their children were also unaccounted for, that Jeremy had gone to look at animatronics and hadn't come back, and that Susie had been playing arcade games but was now nowhere to be found, that Fritz and Cassidy similarly couldn't be located. Restaurant management initially treated this as a lost children situation rather than an emergency. In a busy pizzeria with multiple rooms and entertainment areas, it wasn't unusual for children to wander, to get distracted and lose track of time, to end up in unexpected places. Staff began a systematic search, checking all public areas, looking in bathrooms, examining arcade sections, even searching back areas where children weren't supposed to go. They found nothing. No sign of the missing children anywhere. As minutes turned to an hour, as the systematic search continued without results, the situation escalated. This wasn't children playing hide and seek. This wasn't kids who had wandered outside and gotten distracted. 5 children had somehow vanished from inside the restaurant, an enclosed space with limited exits, all of which were monitored or at least visible to staff. The realization that something seriously wrong had occurred prompted management to call police. Law enforcement responded with appropriate urgency once notified. Missing children cases trigger immediate action, particularly cases involving multiple victims from a single location. Officers arrived at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and began their own search, more thorough than what staff had conducted, checking every room, every closet, every storage space, every area where children could potentially be hiding or trapped. They interviewed parents to establish when each child was last seen and by whom, and they interviewed staff to understand restaurant layout, to identify who had been working, to review any unusual incidents or observations from the day. Security camera footage became a crucial focus of the investigation. The cameras had been running throughout the day, recording the restaurant's interior on tape systems that preserved footage for review. Investigators spent hours reviewing this footage, looking for any sign of the missing children, trying to track their movements through the restaurant, identifying the moment when each disappeared from view. This review revealed something disturbing. A person in a yellow mascot costume, identified as Spring Bonnie, based on his distinctive appearance, had been present in areas where children were last seen before they vanished. The footage wasn't conclusive in the sense of showing the actual abductions or providing clear identification of who was inside the costume. Security cameras in 1985 recorded at lower resolution and frame rates than modern systems, producing grainy black and white images where details could be ambiguous. The mascot costume completely concealed the wearer's identity. Multiple people theoretically had access to the costume and might have been wearing it at different times during a shift. The footage established that someone in Spring Bonnie had been present at relevant times and places, but it couldn't prove who that someone was beyond reasonable doubt. Witness statements from other children and parents corroborated the camera evidence. Multiple people reported seeing someone in a Spring Bonnie costume that day. Some witnesses described seeing the costume figure interacting with children, leading them toward back areas, behaving in ways that seemed normal for a mascot performer at the time, but that took on sinister significance in retrospect. One critical witness may have been a child who saw Spring Bonnie with Susie near the arcade area, or another who noticed the yellow rabbit leading children through doors marked for staff only. These statements, combined with the camera footage, created a clear picture. Whoever killed the children had used the Spring Bonnie costume as disguise and method of gaining trust. William Afton was questioned as part of the investigation. As co-founder and employee of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, he had knowledge of the premises, access to areas like the safe room, and familiarity with the Spring Bonnie costume. Investigators noted that Afton had been working on June 26th, that he had opportunity to commit the crimes, and that he had no solid alibi for the specific times when children disappeared. However, multiple staff members had been working that day. Others also had access to the costume theoretically. Without direct evidence placing Afton specifically inside the Spring Bonnie suit during the relevant time periods, suspicion wasn't enough for arrest. The investigation's central challenge was the absence of bodies. Modern forensic science teaches us that murders without bodies present enormous difficulties for prosecution. Even with strong circumstantial evidence, even with motive and opportunity, proving someone guilty of murder when the alleged victims' bodies haven't been found and death can't be verified requires overcoming significant legal hurdles. prosecutors need to establish beyond reasonable doubt that victims are dead, not just missing, and that the defendant caused those deaths. Without physical evidence, without bodies to examine for cause and manner of death, these burdens become extremely difficult to meet. Extensive searches of the restaurant continued for days. Police brought in search dogs, examined plumbing and ventilation systems, pulled up sections of flooring, investigated every space large enough to conceal a body. They found nothing. The safe room, being off official floor plans and sealed behind walls, wasn't discovered during these searches. This was precisely what Afton had counted on. He had hidden the bodies in the only location that wouldn't be found through normal investigation, a space that technically didn't exist according to official records, that was invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where and how to look. Afton was eventually arrested based on the video's surveillance evidence and witness statements placing someone in Spring Bonnie, near where children disappeared. The arrest made headlines locally, provided temporary relief to a community desperate to believe the person responsible had been caught. But the arrest didn't hold. Without bodies, without physical evidence beyond suspicious circumstances, without anything to prove the children were dead, rather than kidnapped and taken elsewhere, without clear identification of Afton as the person inside the costume, armed prosecutors couldn't build a case strong enough for conviction. Afton was released after being charged, or perhaps before charges were even formally filed, freed on the technicality that murder couldn't be proven without victims' bodies. This failure of justice devastated the families of the missing children. They knew in their hearts that their children were dead, that whoever had taken them wasn't keeping them alive somewhere. Parents' instincts, the passage of time without contact, the circumstances of the disappearances all pointed toward murder. But legal systems require evidence, not intuition. The families had to endure seeing the man they believed killed their children walking free, continuing to live in the same community, maintaining his position with Fazbear Entertainment, protected by technicalities and lack of forensic proof. Fazbear Entertainment's response to the investigation was protective of company interests first, concerned with victims and truth distant second. Management cooperated with police minimally as required by law, provided access to premises and footage, but didn't volunteer information about the safe room, about Springlock suit storage locations, about the full layout of the building including spaces not on official plans. Whether this reflected active cover-up or simply negligence, whether management truly didn't know about the safe room or chose not to reveal it, remains ambiguous. What's clear is that the company prioritized avoiding liability and maintaining business over assisting investigation completely. Media coverage of the missing children incident was extensive locally and received some national attention. Headlines screamed variations of 5 children vanish from family pizzeria, with news reports detailing the circumstances, the investigation's progress, the arrest and release of a suspect. This coverage damaged Freddy Fazbear's Pizza's reputation severely. Parents who had previously considered it a safe place for children now viewed it with suspicion and fear. Birthday party bookings dropped dramatically. Regular customer traffic declined. The restaurant, that should have been recovering from this trauma instead, found itself hemorrhaging business as the community's trust evaporated. The physical evidence that would eventually confirm the children's fate began to manifest in following weeks and months. The animatronics began to malfunction in unusual ways. Staff reported odd smells emanating from the suits, foul odors that cleaning couldn't eliminate, reminiscent of decomposition. the animatronics' facial areas began to leak fluids, blood and mucus appearing around eyes and mouths, seeping through gaps in the costumes. Parents who brought children to the restaurant, despite the tragedy, began to complain about these issues, describing the animatronics as having a quality like reanimated carcasses, a description that appeared in news coverage and further damaged the restaurant's reputation. These symptoms suggested what investigators hadn't been able to prove, that the children's bodies were inside the animatronic suits. Whether they had been stuffed into the costumes by William Afton as part of his disposal method, or whether something else had placed them there, the physical evidence strongly implied this hiding place. However, by the time these signs became undeniable, the restaurant was closed for health code violations, the animatronics were in storage or had been relocated, and accessing them for forensic examination became complicated by company resistance and legal protections around private property. The investigation officially remained open but inactive. The case files listed 5 children as missing, presumed dead based on time elapsed and circumstances. But without bodies, official determination of death couldn't be made immediately. The families of Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy had to live in a limbo state, knowing their children were gone, but unable to hold funerals, unable to have legal death certificates, unable to achieve closure that might have come from confirmed deaths and proper burials, and this ambiguity added an extra layer of cruelty to their suffering. Years later, when Henry Emily orchestrated the final confrontation with William Afton and the possessed animatronics in Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, when he burned the building with all of them inside, when the completion ending showed graves on a hillside with the children's names, this represented a kind of posthumous justice. The children's spirits were freed, their names were remembered. Simple markers acknowledged their existence and their loss. But this came too late to help the investigation, too late to achieve justice through legal systems, too late to provide the families with answers when those answers might have brought some measure of peace. The missing children incident investigation stands as an example of how crimes can remain unsolved despite strong suspicions, how perpetrators can escape justice through careful planning and exploitation of system limitations, how the absence of physical evidence can doom prosecution even when moral certainty exists. William Afton committed 5 murders in broad daylight in a public location and walked away free because he understood what evidence would be needed to convict him and ensured that evidence wouldn't exist. This represents a profound failure, not just of investigation, but of the systems meant to protect children and punish those who harm them. The puppet's intervention: give gifts, give life. The story of the missing children incident doesn't end with 5 bodies hidden in a sealed room. What happened next elevated the tragedy from criminal horror to supernatural legend, as Charlotte Emily's spirit, possessing the security puppet, intervened to grant the murdered children a form of continued existence that would shape everything that followed in 5 Nights at Freddy's lore. Charlotte Emily, known as Charlie in the fandom, was William Afton's first victim, murdered outside Fredbear's family diner in 1983, when she was locked out of the building during a party. Her death occurred before the missing children incident, establishing a precedent that Afton would later attempt to replicate deliberately. Charlotte's spirit possessed the security puppet, the animatronic designed by her father, Henry Emily, to protect her through a bracelet-based monitoring system. The puppet's programming included directives to keep Charlotte safe and to ensure she didn't leave the restaurant unattended. To protect the child, its systems were designed around. When Charlotte died beyond its reach, when the puppet crawled through rain to find her body and shut down beside her, her essence merged with the machine in the first known case of possession in the Fazbear universe. The puppet's possession granted Charlotte continued awareness and agency beyond death. Unlike the confusion and limited consciousness that would characterize other possessed animatronics, the puppet demonstrated clear intelligence, purposeful action, and understanding of its situation. Charlotte maintained enough of her humanity to care about others, enough of her capacity for empathy to recognize when intervention was needed, or enough understanding of how possession worked to deliberately grant it to others as a form of salvation. The Give Gifts, Give Life minigame in Five Nights at Freddy's 2 depicts Charlotte's intervention following the missing children incident. The player controls the puppet in a pixelated environment, moving through a room where 4 bodies lie on the floor, presumably 4 of the 5 missing children. The instruction at the top of the screen reads, "Give gifts," and the puppet approaches each body, presenting them with objects that appear as simple shapes in the abstracted pixel art. Once gifts have been given to all 4 bodies, the instruction changes to "Give Life," and the puppet must approach each body again. When the puppet gives life, animatronic heads appear on the bodies: Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy. This represents the moment when Charlotte bound the children's spirits to the animatronic suits, creating the possessions that would haunt Freddy Fazbear's Pizza for years. The process wasn't random placement, but deliberate pairing, matching children to specific animatronics in ways that would become part of their identity going forward. Gabriel into Freddy, Jeremy into Bonnie, Susie into Chica, Fritz into Foxy. After the 4 visible bodies receive gifts and life, the minigame glitches. A 5th body appears in the center of the room, and before the puppet can approach it, Golden Freddy's jump scare fills the screen, ending the minigame. This 5th body is Cassidy, whose possession of Golden Freddy apparently occurred differently than the others, perhaps without the puppet's direct intervention, and perhaps through different mechanisms that resulted in Golden Freddy's unique properties as a quasi-corporeal entity. The question of whether Charlotte or Afton stuffed the bodies into the animatronic suits has been debated in the fandom. The Give Life sequence in the minigame focuses on spiritual binding rather than physical placement, suggesting Charlotte's role was granting possession rather than moving corpses. However, someone physically placed the children's bodies inside the animatronic suits, as evidenced by the blood, mucus, and decomposition smells that would later emanate from them. The most likely scenario is that Afton stuffed the bodies as part of hiding evidence, and Charlotte subsequently bound the spirits to those same suits, creating a situation where body and soul were paired in the same location. As Charlotte's motivation for granting possession is worth examining. From one perspective, she was offering the children a form of continued existence, preventing them from simply dying and moving on to whatever lies beyond. The spirits would remain in the mortal world, aware and capable of action, granted the kind of persistence that Charlotte herself experienced. From another perspective, possession might have been intended as a gift of vengeance, giving the murdered children the means to pursue justice against their killer, to haunt the location where they died, to prevent similar tragedies if possible. Henry Emily's speech in the completion ending of Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator addresses Charlotte directly, acknowledging her role. And to you, my brave volunteer, who somehow found this job listing not intended for you. Although, and there was a way out planned for you, I have a feeling that's not what you want. I have a feeling that you are right where you want to be. This suggests Charlotte's continued existence and her actions in granting life to the other children were choices, rather than accidents, that she voluntarily maintained her presence in the mortal world to help others, that her possession served a purpose she found meaningful despite the tragedy of her own death. The gift and life that Charlotte provided came with costs. The possessed children didn't fully understand their situation. They experienced confusion about their deaths, about the passage of time, about their new existence as spirits bound to mechanical bodies. Their awareness was limited and fragmented. They could maintain basic identity, remember their names, retain emotions like anger and fear, but complex reasoning and memory appeared compromised. Scott Cawthon described the possessed animatronics as having animal-like intelligence, reacting based on instinct and emotion, rather than logical planning. This limited awareness meant the children's vengeance became indiscriminate. Unable to distinguish between William Afton and other adult men, unable to recognize that security guards weren't their killers, the possessed animatronics attacked any adult who entered Freddy Fazbear's Pizza after dark. They viewed night guards as threats, as targets, as beings to be stopped through any means necessary. This led to numerous incidents over the years, guards threatened and killed by animatronics that perceived them as enemies, are perpetuating a cycle of violence that the children couldn't break free from due to their limited understanding. Charlotte's own actions after binding the children's spirits involved protecting them while they existed in this state. The puppet appeared in multiple games across the series, always with a sense of purpose and awareness that distinguished it from other possessed animatronics. In Five Nights at Freddy's 2, the puppet could be kept at bay by winding a music box, suggesting it could be calmed or soothed rather than simply feared. In later games, the puppet appeared in minigames associated with helping the children find peace, with the happiest day scenario, where spirits gathered to finally move on. The supernatural mechanics of possession in Five Nights at Freddy's involve what the series terms remnant, a substance that binds souls to physical objects. Remnant appears to form naturally when violent death occurs near animatronic components, when emotional energy and mechanical systems interact in ways that create a kind of spiritual adhesive. Charlotte's deliberate binding of spirits might have involved manipulating remnant, understanding intuitively how to create the conditions for possession, even without scientific knowledge of what she was doing. William Afton would later study remnant scientifically, attempting to understand and replicate what Charlotte accomplished instinctively. His experiments involved harvesting remnant from the possessed animatronics by melting down their endoskeletons and injecting this material into other animatronics to grant them possession artificially. This represented Afton's attempt to achieve what Charlotte achieved, binding souls to machinery, creating a form of immortality through possession, transcending death by merging consciousness with mechanical forms. The ethical implications of Charlotte's actions deserve consideration. Did the murdered children benefit from possession, or were they trapped in a state worse than simply dying? Would they have preferred to move on immediately to find whatever peace or afterlife exists, rather than spending years bound to animatronic shells, confused and angry, lashing out at innocence? Charlotte made a choice on their behalf, granted them continued existence without their consent, decided that possession was preferable to death. Was she right? That the happiest day minigame in Five Nights at Freddy's 3 suggests that the children did eventually desire release, that they needed help moving on from their possessed state, that remaining bound to animatronics indefinitely wasn't their preference, Once they understood, it was possible to leave. The minigame shows the children gathered for a party, receiving cake from Charlotte as the puppet, removing their masks, fading away to finally rest. This implies that while possession might have been necessary or beneficial initially, it became a prison that required intervention to escape. Henry Emily designed the final trap in Pizzeria Simulator, partly to free his daughter along with the other spirits. His closing speech addresses her directly, acknowledging that she had remained where she wanted to be, doing what she thought was right, protecting the children she had tried to save. But he also provides her an exit, a way to finally rest after years of service, recognition that her vigil had to end for her own sake as well as others. The Give Gifts, Give Life minigame represents a crucial turning point in Five Nights at Freddy's lore. Before Charlotte's intervention, the missing children incident was a tragedy but not a supernatural event. After her intervention, the spirits of murdered children inhabited animatronics, creating the hauntings that define the franchise. Charlotte transformed 5 deaths into 5 possessions, 5 victims into 5 vengeful spirits, 5 children into the supernatural force that would eventually bring about William Afton's downfall. Understanding Charlotte's role requires recognizing her as both victim and hero, a both trapped spirit and active agent of change, both a child who died too young and an entity that protected others from her fate while pursuing justice against the man who killed her and them. Her intervention didn't prevent the tragedy of the missing children incident, didn't save the 5 lives that Afton took, but it ensured those lives wouldn't be forgotten, that those deaths wouldn't go unanswered, that the children would have a form of agency even in death that might eventually lead to the justice the legal system failed to provide. The aftermath, blood, mucus, and decay, the physical manifestations of the possessed animatronics became impossible to ignore in the weeks and months following June 26, 1985. What began as subtle oddities in the machine's behavior escalated into overt signs that something profoundly wrong had occurred, and transforming the animatronics from entertaining performers into horrifying reminders of hidden tragedy. The first signs were olfactory. Staff members working at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza began reporting unusual smells emanating from the animatronic suits. Initially, these were attributed to lack of cleaning, to the suits simply needing routine maintenance and sanitation. Fabric and padding in costumes worn in hot, humid environments where children's hands touch them constantly would develop odors naturally. But these smells were different. They were organic and biological in ways that shouldn't have been possible from machines. They were reminiscent of decay, of meat going bad, of something dead and rotting. Cleaning attempts failed to eliminate the odors. Staff would take suits to be laundered, would scrub internal components. I would apply deodorizers and sanitizing agents. But within hours or days, the smells would return. The odors seemed to come from within the suits themselves, from areas that couldn't be accessed without dismantling the animatronics completely, from deep in the mechanical bodies where something was wrong but couldn't be reached through normal maintenance procedures. Parents bringing children to the restaurant began to complain. The smell was noticeable even from a distance, particularly around the stage where the animatronics performed. It created an unpleasant atmosphere that contradicted the cheerful environment the restaurant tried to maintain. Some parents asked staff what the smell was, receiving vague assurances about cleaning issues or mechanical problems. Others simply left, are unwilling to subject their children to an environment that smelled like death. even if they couldn't articulate exactly why the smell disturbed them so deeply. Then came the visible signs. Blood and mucus began appearing on the animatronics, leaking from gaps in the costumes around the facial areas, eyes and mouths weeping fluids that shouldn't exist in mechanical bodies. Staff would clean these away during closing procedures, wiping down the suits, removing the disturbing evidence, but the next day more would appear. The fluids were real, biological, consistent with decomposition and bodily breakdown, impossible to explain as anything other than evidence of organic material inside the supposedly mechanical entertainers. The leaking became more pronounced over time. What started as small stains and damp spots escalated to visible dripping, fluids collecting in puddles beneath the animatronics when they remained stationary for extended periods. The coloration and consistency of these fluids left no doubt about their nature. This was blood, or what remained of blood after days and weeks of decomposition. This was the physical evidence of death seeping out of machines that should have contained only servos and circuitry. One particularly damning report came from a parent who described the animatronics as having qualities like reanimated carcasses. This description appeared in news coverage and spread through the community, becoming shorthand for what people were experiencing at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The animatronics didn't just look wrong. They didn't just smell wrong. They had the unmistakable character of death wearing a costume, of corpses propped up and forced to perform, of something that had died being puppeted by forces that wouldn't let it rest. Management's response was inadequate and suspicious. Rather than immediately shut down operations, rather than call authorities to investigate these biological manifestations, Fazbear Entertainment attempted to continue business as usual. They increased cleaning frequency. They discussed purchasing new animatronic suits to replace the contaminated ones. They offered explanations about humidity and climate control creating condensation that mixed with paint and lubricants to create unfortunate appearances. These explanations satisfied no one who actually saw and smelled what was happening. High health inspectors eventually got involved based on customer complaints. Multiple reports of unsanitary conditions, of blood and biological fluids present in a food service establishment, of smells suggesting decomposition in areas where children ate, triggered official investigation. The inspectors found conditions that violated numerous health codes that represented genuine hazards to public health that couldn't be allowed to continue. Citations were issued. Demands were made for immediate remediation. The restaurant was threatened with closure if conditions didn't improve dramatically and immediately. Fazbear Entertainment faced an impossible choice. They could dismantle the animatronics completely to investigate the source of the biological contamination, and which would reveal the hidden bodies and expose the company to criminal culpability for concealing evidence. Or they could continue attempting superficial cleaning while the problem persisted and worsened, eventually leading to forced closure by health authorities. There was no good option, no path forward that didn't result in disaster for the company. The supernatural element of the possessions may have contributed to the physical manifestations. The children's spirits inhabiting the animatronics might have caused the machines to reject the corpses stuffed inside them, pushing biological materials outward, causing decomposition to accelerate or express itself in ways that wouldn't happen with passive corpses hidden in sealed containers. The intersection of spiritual energy and physical matter created conditions where death couldn't be hidden completely, where evidence forced its way into visibility despite all attempts at concealment. The animatronics' behavior during this period also changed in ways that frightened staff and visitors. They would move at unexpected times, not following their programmed routines, turning to stare at specific people, making sounds that weren't part of their voice lines. Staff reported feeling watched by the animatronics, even when they were supposedly powered down. Security guards working night shifts described being stalked by the machines, pursued through the restaurant by animatronics that shouldn't have been active, that moved with purpose and hostility, rather than the jerky, programmed motions of normal automated performers. And these behavioral changes, combined with the physical evidence of death, created an atmosphere of palpable wrongness. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza became known as a cursed location, a place where something terrible had happened and where that terrible thing hadn't been resolved. Urban legends grew around the restaurant, stories of ghosts and haunted machines, tales told by teenagers daring each other to approach the building after dark, rumors that spread through schools and neighborhoods until the restaurant became synonymous with horror rather than entertainment. The financial impact was devastating. Customers stopped coming. Birthday party bookings dropped to nearly zero. Regular dining traffic declined to the point where staying open became unsustainable. The restaurant that had been thriving before June 26, 1985, was now hemorrhaging money, unable to overcome its reputation, unable to convince parents that bringing children there was safe or appropriate. The missing children incident had already damaged the restaurant's reputation. The physical manifestations of the hidden corpses made recovery impossible. Fazbear Entertainment attempted damage control through various means. They considered rebranding, changing the restaurant's name and imagery to distance from the tragedy. They discussed relocating, abandoning the contaminated building and starting fresh elsewhere. They explored legal options for limiting liability, ensuring that when the inevitable revelations came, the company could survive the fallout. But all these plans were undermined by the ongoing physical evidence that wouldn't stop appearing, that couldn't be hidden or explained away, and that forced the issue toward eventual closure. The restaurant closed by year's end following the missing children incident, unable to remain viable given the combination of damaged reputation, health code violations, supernatural manifestations, and customer abandonment. The closure was presented as temporary, with vague promises of renovations and safety improvements before reopening. In reality, this particular location would never reopen. The building would stand abandoned, the animatronics stored or moved to other locations, the site becoming a monument to tragedy and corporate failure. The bodies hidden inside the animatronic suits remained undiscovered officially for years, possibly decades in the timeline of the games. When they were eventually found, when forensic examination confirmed that the missing children's remains had been inside the machines all along, it would validate everything the physical manifestations had been signaling. The blood and mucus, the smells of decay, the descriptions of reanimated carcasses were all literally accurate. The animatronics had been corpse containers, hiding the victims of murder, seeping evidence that was seen but not acted upon, displaying the truth that no one wanted to confront. This failure to investigate the obvious signs represents another systemic breakdown. Health inspectors focused on sanitation violations rather than criminal investigation. Management concealed rather than revealed. Staff cleaned away evidence rather than reported it. The community suspected but didn't demand action. And everyone involved in some way failed the murdered children by not recognizing or acting on the clear physical evidence that something horrifically wrong had happened, and that proof of it was literally leaking from the animatronics costumes. The aftermath of the missing children incident demonstrates how cover-ups unravel slowly, how evidence forces itself into visibility despite attempts to hide it, how the physical and spiritual refuse to remain completely concealed even when powerful incentives exist to keep secrets. The blood and mucus seeping from the animatronics were the murdered children's silent testimony, their bodies speaking when their voices had been stolen, their presence demanding acknowledgement, even though acknowledgement would expose horrible truth. The possessed animatronics, the 5 murdered children's spirits bound to Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and Golden Freddy, transformed these entertainment machines into something entirely different from their intended purpose. Understanding how the possessions manifested, how they affected the animatronics' behavior, and why they created the specific threats depicted in the games requires examining the intersection of consciousness, machinery, and supernatural forces. Possession in the 5 Nights at Freddy's universe doesn't simply mean a spirit inhabits a machine, while the machine continues operating normally. The children's souls fundamentally altered the animatronics, granting them agency beyond their programming, creating hybrid entities that were neither purely mechanical nor purely spiritual. And the animatronics retained their physical forms and capabilities while gaining motivations, awareness, and behaviors that emerged from the confused consciousness of murdered children. Gabriel's spirit possessing Freddy Fazbear created the central threat of the original game. Freddy, as the leader of the animatronic band, became the avatar for the murdered birthday boy, the child who died on what should have been his happiest day. Gabriel maintained enough awareness to recognize that he was dead, that something terrible had happened, but his understanding was fragmented and partial. He couldn't fully remember being Gabriel, couldn't piece together exactly what had occurred, but he knew that adults were dangerous, that someone had hurt him, that he needed to protect himself and the others from further harm. Our Freddy's behavior reflected this confused state. During the day, when the restaurant was open and children were present, Freddy performed normally, running through program routines, singing songs, entertaining crowds. But at night, when only security guards were present, when the restaurant was empty except for adults who resembled the killer in general form, Freddy became hostile and aggressive. He would leave the stage, navigate through the restaurant, approach the security office with clear hostile intent, attempting to reach the guard inside. The methodology of Freddy's attacks suggested limited reasoning combined with strong instinct. He moved through specific paths, responded to certain stimuli like camera observation by becoming more aggressive, and followed patterns that players could learn and counter, but that also demonstrated basic problem-solving capabilities beyond simple programming. This hybrid of mechanical behavior and spiritual intent created the unique horror of confronting what seemed like a machine, but was actually something more, something with will and purpose and hostility born from trauma. Jeremy possessing Bonnie created one of the most aggressive animatronics in the original game. Bonnie didn't wait or move cautiously. He left the stage first among the animatronics, moved quickly through the restaurant, and appeared in the security office suddenly and without much warning if the guard wasn't paying attention. This aggressiveness might reflect Jeremy's personality in life, or it might reflect the particular trauma and anger of his death, or it might simply be a function of how his spiritual energy manifested through Bonnie's mechanical form. Bonnie's design featured prominent teeth, visible in his permanent grin, creating an unsettling appearance even before possession added malevolent intent. When possessed by Jeremy's spirit, those teeth became threatening, suggesting violence, creating visceral fear in players who saw Bonnie approaching. The purple coloring of Bonnie's fur might have made him slightly less visible in dark environments, adding to the jump scare factor when he appeared in doorways or directly in the office. Susie's possession of Chica created unique characteristics that distinguished this animatronic from the others. Chica carried a cupcake, a companion element that appeared in various forms throughout the series, sometimes possessed itself, and sometimes simply a prop. The cupcake's presence connected to Susie's story about her dog, with some theories suggesting the cupcake contains the dog's spirit, though this remains speculative. What's certain is that Chica displays emotional qualities that hint at Susie's maintained consciousness. The week before novel establishes that Chica has painful memories relating to birthdays, reacting with distress when confronted with birthday imagery, or when someone sings "Happy Birthday." Susie apparently died at or near a birthday celebration, either Gabriel's party or possibly her own, creating trauma associations that persisted in her possessed state. When security guard Ralph encountered Chica and tried to comfort her by singing "Happy Birthday," Chica's reaction was to scream and destroy a cupcake violently, and demonstrating emotional pain that transcended mere programming or simple haunting. Fritz possessing Foxy created perhaps the most visually distinct possessed animatronic. Foxy was already separated from the main group, hidden behind a curtain in Pirate's Cove, marked as out of order even before possession. This isolation might have reflected the restaurant's recognition that something was wrong with Foxy specifically, or it might have been part of the normal rotation where Foxy's performances were separate from the main band shows. Either way, the separation added to Foxy's mystique and made his attacks particularly startling. Foxy's behavior involved sprinting toward the security office when no one was watching Pirate's Cove through cameras. This created a unique mechanic where ignoring Foxy was dangerous, but watching him too much wasted limited resources. Fritz's spirit apparently granted Foxy mobility that the animatronic might not have possessed in normal operation, or perhaps enhanced existing capabilities beyond their program parameters. The result was a threat that moved differently from the others, that required different strategies to manage, that represented the diversity of personalities and behaviors among the possessed machines. Cassidy possessing Golden Freddy created the most supernatural and least physically consistent animatronic. Golden Freddy appeared and disappeared without explanation, manifesting in the office as a slouched figure that would crash the game if observed too long, creating immediate consequences for encountering it. This quasi-corporeal nature suggested Golden Freddy existed partially outside normal physical rules, more ghost than possessed machine, more supernatural force than animatronic with spirit inside. Golden Freddy's behavior across the series reflected Cassidy's particular nature as the vengeful spirit who refused to move on. While other children could be coaxed toward peace, could accept release when offered, Cassidy maintained anger and determination to punish William Afton specifically. This manifested in Golden Freddy's persistent appearances across multiple games, in the character's role in Ultimate Custom Night as Afton's eternal tormentor, in the refusal to fade away even when circumstances suggested the spirit should have been freed. The possessed animatronics shared common characteristics despite their individual differences, and they all became active after dark, suggesting their spiritual control overwrote whatever programming kept them stationary during closed hours. They all displayed hostility toward adult humans, attacking security guards without discrimination, unable or unwilling to distinguish between their actual killer and innocent people who happened to resemble him in general demographics. They all retained enough awareness to navigate the restaurant, to understand doors as barriers that could be closed against them, to recognize the security office as their target location. Scott Cawthon described the possessed animatronics as having animal-like intelligence, a characterization that fits their behaviors well. They acted on instinct and emotion rather than complex reasoning. They could learn basic patterns and respond to stimuli, but they didn't demonstrate human-level cognition or planning. This limited intelligence stemmed from the fragmentary nature of the children's consciousness after death. Their awareness reduced to essential drives, revenge, self-protection, confused anger that didn't include nuanced understanding of their situation. The tragedy of the possessed animatronics lies partly in this confusion. The children didn't choose to remain as spirits. They didn't understand they were dead initially. They didn't recognize that the night guards they attacked were innocent people. They were trapped in a state between life and death, aware enough to suffer, but not aware enough to understand or escape their situation without external intervention. And the possessions that Charlotte Emily granted as gifts of continued existence became prisons that the children couldn't recognize as such. The animatronics' famous behavior of attempting to stuff night guards into spare animatronic suits, resulting in death, creates another layer of horror. This behavior is explained in game lore as the animatronics mistaking humans for endoskeletons without costumes, attempting to fix this by forcing the person into a suit. But the supernatural realities suggest darker motivations. Perhaps the children, in their confused state, wanted to share their fate with others, wanted to create more possessed animatronics, wanted company in their mechanical prisons, or perhaps they simply wanted to kill adults they perceived as threats, and the stuffing was the method their mechanical bodies enabled. The possessed animatronics' interactions with each other remain largely unexplored in explicit lore, but they seem to act cooperatively toward the common goal of reaching the security office. They didn't fight among themselves, didn't compete for the same paths, didn't display conflict despite being different spirits with different personalities. This suggests either that they maintain some awareness of being connected through shared trauma, or that their possession created a kind of hive mind or shared purpose that overrode individual differences. The supernatural mechanics of their movements, animatronics moving when not observed, becoming more aggressive when watched through cameras, responding to light and sound in ways that suggested awareness beyond programming. Ye all point to spirits that granted machines qualities they shouldn't possess. These weren't glitches or malfunctions. These were deliberate behaviors driven by consciousness, by the murdered children's spirits using metal and circuitry as bodies, learning to operate their new forms through instinct and necessity. The possessions would persist until intervention finally freed the spirits. The happiest day. Minigame showed the children gathered for a celebration, receiving cake from Charlotte as the puppet, removing their masks to reveal their true faces, fading away to finally rest. This represented closure decades delayed, peace achieved only after their murderer had been confronted and defeated, justice served through supernatural means since human systems had failed. The animatronics that had been their prisons could finally stand empty, a metal shells without souls inside, retired from their roles as both entertainers and vessels for the dead. Understanding the possessed animatronics means recognizing them as victims who became threats, as children whose deaths transformed them into dangers to innocence, as spirits bound to machines in ways that created horror from tragedy. They were never monsters. They were never evil. They were 5 young people who died violently, who were granted continued existence in forms they couldn't fully comprehend or control, who lashed out from confusion and pain, and the instinctive need to protect themselves from further harm, even when that harm was never coming from the people they attacked. Legacy and long-term consequences. The missing children incident didn't end on June 26, 1985, or with the closure of the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza by year's end. Its consequences rippled forward through time, affecting every subsequent location, every business decision, every attempt to resurrect the Fazbear brand, creating a legacy of tragedy that would define the company and the franchise for decades to come. Fazbear Entertainment's reputation never recovered from the incident. The company that had once represented family fun and birthday celebrations became associated with child murder, disappearances, and haunted animatronics. Parents who had trusted the establishment before June 1985 would never fully trust it again. Even when new locations opened with new designs and safety assurances, the spectre of the missing children hung over everything, an unspoken reminder that terrible things had happened at a Freddy Fazbear's location and might happen again. The company attempted various strategies to overcome this poison legacy. They opened new locations with updated animatronic designs, introducing the toy animatronics in 1987, with improved facial recognition technology, supposedly capable of identifying predators from a criminal database. But these technological improvements couldn't overcome the fundamental problem. William Afton remained involved with the company, and his presence guaranteed continued tragedy. In 1987, another 5 children disappeared at the new location, victims of what became known as the second missing children incident or the Save Them murders. This pattern of opening new locations, experiencing tragedies, closing, and trying again repeated throughout the company's history. Each new pizzeria represented an attempt to start fresh, to create distance from past horrors, to prove that Fazbear Entertainment could be what it originally promised to be. And each time, something went wrong. Animatronics exhibited strange behaviors. Incidents occurred. Children were endangered or worse. The cycle perpetuated because the root cause, William Afton's ongoing involvement, and the supernatural consequences of his actions, was never addressed until much later. The spirits of the 5 original missing children played direct roles in Afton's eventual fate. Years after their deaths, when Afton returned to the abandoned original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location to dismantle the possessed animatronics, seeking to harvest the remnant binding their spirits for his experiments, the children's ghosts manifested and cornered him. In panic, Afton hid inside the Spring Bonnie suit, the same costume he'd worn to murder them. The suit's Springlock mechanisms, weakened by years of moisture exposure in the sealed safe room, failed catastrophically, crushing and impaling Afton from inside. This should have killed him instantly, but instead, it created Springtrap. Afton's body merged with the Spring Bonnie animatronic, his soul bound to the machine in a twisted mirror of what he had done to his victims. The murdered children achieved a form of poetic justice, destroying their killer using the very tool he'd used to gain their trust, trapping him in the same kind of possessed mechanical existence they endured. Though this victory was incomplete, as Afton would persist for decades more as Springtrap and later forms, it represented the first direct consequence he faced for the missing children murders. The legal and institutional failures that allowed Afton to escape justice set precedents that affected how subsequent incidents were handled. When authorities couldn't prove the children were dead without bodies, when video evidence wasn't enough for conviction, when circumstantial evidence fell short of legal standards for prosecution, These failures taught Fazbear Entertainment that they could conceal information, avoid cooperation with investigators, prioritize corporate interests over justice, and likely escape serious consequences. This pattern of institutional corruption and cover-up became characteristic of how the company operated going forward. For the missing children incident influenced the design and operation of future Fazbear locations. Safe rooms were officially sealed and their existence erased from records, theoretically preventing their use as hidden murder locations. Employee training emphasized stranger danger protocols and monitoring of guest interactions with mascot performers. Security systems were upgraded with more cameras and better coverage, though gaps and vulnerabilities always remained. These changes represented reactive attempts to prevent recurrence of specific circumstances, rather than addressing underlying problems. The incident's impact on the families of the victims persisted for lifetimes. Gabriel's parents never celebrated his birthday again, the date forever marked as the day they lost him. Susie's family mourned both their daughter and the dog, whose death had been weaponized to lure her. Jeremy's mother faced decades without answers, without closure, without even confirmed death to allow funeral and mourning rituals. Fritz's family carried grief mixed with guilt over being unable to protect him in a place they'd believed was safe. Cassidy's parents lived with the knowledge that their child's death had somehow been different, that Cassidy's spirit had remained active longer than others, seeking vengeance rather than peace. The broader community of Hurricane, Utah was also affected, a small town where everyone knew everyone, where the disappearance of 5 children in a single day represented a catastrophic trauma to the social fabric. Parents became overprotective, unwilling to let children out of sight. A trust in local institutions and businesses evaporated. The town's innocence, if such a thing exists in American small towns, was shattered irreparably. Hurricane became known as the place where that terrible thing happened, a reputation that persisted long after the restaurant closed. The supernatural legacy of the incident extended beyond the original 5 spirits. The possessions they underwent established precedent and mechanism for other spirits to inhabit machines. Charlotte, Emily's method of binding souls to animatronics became something William Afton studied and replicated through his remnant experiments. The concept of remnant itself, the physical substance that carries spiritual essence, might have been discovered or refined through analysis of the possessed animatronics that resulted from the missing children incident. A later animatronics across the series showed signs of possession or remnant influence that trace back to the original 5 children. When Afton harvested remnant from the possessed animatronics by melting their endoskeletons, he created a kind of spiritual material that could be injected into other machines to grant them similar properties. This led to the creation of the Funtime animatronics with their haunted behaviors, the amalgamation known as Enard that combined multiple spirits, and eventually to the digital manifestations like Glitchtrap that emerged when remnant-infected circuit boards were scanned into virtual reality systems. The philosophical and theological implications of the incident also deserve consideration. The possessions proved that human souls exist, that consciousness persists beyond physical death, that supernatural forces operate in the world, that technology can interact with the spiritual realm in ways that create hybrid existences. These discoveries, if recognized and studied properly, would revolutionize understanding of life, death, and the nature of consciousness. But instead of being scientifically examined and shared with the world, they were concealed by corporate interests and exploited by William Afton for his own purposes. The failure to properly investigate and acknowledge what happened created a situation where the same mistakes repeated. If the possessions had been recognized, if the supernatural element had been accepted and studied, perhaps safeguards could have been developed to prevent or contain such phenomena. If William Afton had been properly prosecuted and imprisoned or executed, countless subsequent victims would have been spared. If Fazbear Entertainment had been shut down permanently, rather than allowed to perpetually reopen under new management and names, the cycle of tragedy might have ended much sooner. Henry Emley's final plan in Pizzeria Simulator was designed to address the legacy of the missing children incident by gathering all the possessed animatronics, all the remnant, and William Afton himself in one location and burning everything in a fire hot enough to release the spirits while destroying their physical anchors. This represented his attempt to finally provide the closure and justice that the legal system had failed to deliver in 1985. By burning the animatronics that contained his daughter, the murdered children, and their killer, and Henry hoped to free everyone from the supernatural cycle that the missing children incident had initiated. The gravestone imagery from the completion ending shows the fruits of Henry's sacrifice. 5 graves bearing the names of the murdered children finally acknowledge their deaths publicly, even if only symbolically. Charlotte's grave overlooking the others from a hill represented her role as guardian and guide, who had watched over the children she helped bind to animatronics. These graves weren't real in the sense of containing bodies, the actual remains having been burned in the fire, but they served as monuments, as recognition, as the public acknowledgement that these children had lived and died and deserved to be remembered. The missing children incident established the template that much of Five Nights at Freddy's lore follows. Tragedy leading to possession, possession leading to violence, violence perpetuating cycles that require increasingly drastic intervention to break. It demonstrated how technological innovation without ethical oversight creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited. It showed how institutional failures to protect children and prosecute their killers perpetuate harm across generations. It illustrated how corporate prioritization of profit over people enables horrors to persist and multiply. For the murdered children themselves, the legacy is bittersweet. They were victims who became threats, innocents transformed into dangers through no fault of their own, and children whose deaths granted them terrible forms of continued existence that they never asked for. But their persistence also meant their stories couldn't be buried completely, that William Afton couldn't simply walk away from his crimes, that eventually, through supernatural means, justice found a way to manifest even when human institutions failed. The long-term consequences of June 26, 1985, reached into every corner of the Five Nights at Freddy's universe. Every subsequent game, every new location, every character introduced connects back in some way to those 5 murdered children, to Charlotte Emily who bound them to animatronics, to William Afton who killed them, to Henry Emily who ultimately freed them. The incident was the foundation upon which decades of horror were built, and the original sin from which all other tragedies descended, the moment when a family pizzeria became something much darker, and the boundary between entertainment and nightmare dissolved into confusion and dread. Conclusion. Echoes through time. As we emerge from this comprehensive exploration of the missing children incident, as we step back from the detailed examination of what happened on June 26, 1985, and in all the years that followed, it's worth reflecting on what this story represents both within Five Nights at Freddy's lore and in the broader context of how we process tragedy through fiction. The missing children incident stands as the central tragedy of the entire franchise. the event that everything else builds from or responds to. 5 children entered a family pizzeria for reasons as ordinary as celebrating a birthday, playing arcade games, or spending a summer afternoon, and they never left alive. Their deaths at the hands of a man who used a mascot costume to gain their trust transformed entertainment into horror, innocence into trauma, mechanical performers into supernatural prisons. Understanding this incident means understanding the foundation of everything that follows in the games, the underlying tragedy that explains why animatronics hunt security guards, why spirits linger in machinery, why a simple horror game about surviving night shifts became a complex story about life, death, possession, and justice delayed but eventually delivered. The human cost of what William Afton did cannot be overstated. Gabriel Gardner never got to grow older than 7, never experienced the life milestones that define human existence, never became the person he might have been. Jeremy's potential was stolen before it could be realized. Susie's grief over her dead dog became the tool used to lead her to her own death. Fritz and Cassidy met fates they never could have anticipated when they entered Freddy Fazbear's Pizza that day. Beyond the 5 directly killed, their families were destroyed, their community was traumatized, and everyone who later encountered the possessed animatronics faced dangers that trace back to these murders. Charlotte Emily's intervention in binding the children's spirits to animatronics represented an attempt to grant them some form of continued existence, to prevent them from simply disappearing into death, to give them agency and the possibility of eventual vengeance against their killer. Whether this was truly a gift, or whether it trapped them in a state worse than death, remains ambiguous. They achieved their revenge eventually, cornering Afton and causing the Springlock failure that should have killed him. But the decades they spent as confused spirits inhabiting metal shells, attacking innocent people, unable to fully understand or escape their situation, raises questions about whether the cost of that revenge was worth paying. William Afton's crimes and their consequences illustrate how individual evil can create cascading harm across time. His decision to murder 5 children to study possession and pursue immortality through supernatural means initiated a cycle of tragedy that consumed his entire family, destroyed numerous innocent lives, corrupted Fazbear Entertainment beyond redemption, and ultimately created the conditions for his own destruction. The poetic justice of Afton being killed by the same Spring Bonnie suit he used to commit murders, of being trapped in mechanical possession mirroring what he inflicted on his victims, suggests a universe that eventually punishes evil, even when human justice systems fail. The systemic failures that allowed Afton to escape legal consequences for the missing children incident reflect real-world frustrations with how crimes against children are investigated and prosecuted. The lack of bodies made conviction nearly impossible, despite strong circumstantial evidence and video surveillance placing someone in the Spring Bonnie costume near where children disappeared. And this failure wasn't unique to the fictional universe of Five Nights at Freddy's, but mirrors actual cases where perpetrators escape justice due to lack of physical evidence, where families of victims receive no closure, where communities are left with unresolved trauma and justified anger at systems that fail to protect their children. Fazbear Entertainment's role in concealing evidence, in prioritizing corporate survival over assisting with investigation, in repeatedly reopening despite ongoing tragedies, represents corporate evil distinct from but enabling of Afton's individual crimes. The company created the environment where murders could occur, provided the tools and access that made them possible, then covered up aftermath to protect business interests. This institutional complicity in ongoing harm mirrors real-world examples of companies that value profit over safety, that hide dangers rather than address them, that perpetuate harm through negligence disguised as business as usual. The supernatural elements of the story, the possessions and remnant and spirits inhabiting machinery, provide a framework for exploring themes that resonate beyond literal interpretation. The idea of souls trapped in inappropriate vessels, unable to rest or move forward, speaks to broader human experiences of being stuck in situations we can't escape, of feeling trapped by circumstances, of wanting closure that remains perpetually out of reach. The children's confusion about their deaths, their inability to recognize that they're attacking innocent people rather than their killer, reflects how trauma can warp perception and create cycles of harm where victims become threats to others. The eventual release of the spirits, when Henry Emily gathered all the possessed animatronics and burned them in a fire hot enough to release the supernatural bonds, represented the only path forward that addressed root causes rather than symptoms. It required recognizing that the possessions couldn't be fixed or managed, that the children couldn't be freed through normal means. That drastic action was necessary to break cycles that had perpetuated for decades. This resolution, sacrificing everything to finally grant peace to the victims and eliminate the perpetrator, suggests that some problems require complete destruction rather than incremental reform. The graves shown in the completion ending, as simple markers bearing the names of Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy, provide the public acknowledgement that was missing throughout their existence as possessed animatronics. These children were known, are remembered, are honored despite everything that happened to them. Their stories weren't buried completely. Their names weren't forgotten. The monument to their lives and deaths stands as testimony that they mattered, that their losses were real, that they deserved better than what William Afton gave them, and better than what various institutions failed to provide in terms of justice and closure. For those of us engaging with this story as Five Nights at Freddy's fans, as people who find something compelling in these dark narratives about murdered children and haunted animatronics, it's worth reflecting on why these stories resonate. Perhaps it's the way they explore genuine human fears about child safety, about trusting institutions that might not deserve trust, about evil hiding in plain sight. Perhaps it's the satisfaction of seeing villains eventually face consequences, even if those consequences are supernatural rather than legal. Perhaps it's the tragedy of spirits that can't rest, stuck between life and death, wanting closure but unable to achieve it without help. The missing children incident reminds us that horror, when done well, isn't just about jump scares or creepy animatronics. It's about genuine tragedy, about the horror of children being harmed by adults they should have been able to trust, about systems failing people at their most vulnerable, about consequences that persist long after initial crimes, about the difficulty of achieving justice and peace when evil has been allowed to operate freely. The incident is horrifying not primarily because of supernatural elements, but because of the very human evil at its core. The murder of children by someone who used their innocence against them. As we conclude this comprehensive exploration, as we prepare to step away from the dark halls of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and the tragic events of June 26, 1985, we carry forward the understanding that this incident, these 5 murdered children, represent the beating heart of Five Nights at Freddy's lore. Every game, every new character, every revelation about remnant or possessions or Afton's continued existence traces back to this foundational tragedy. Understanding it means understanding the entire franchise, recognizing why the story resonates, appreciating the complex narrative that Scott Cawthon built from deceptively simple premise of animatronics attacking night guards. The missing children were Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy. They were children who died. Their names deserve to be remembered. Their story deserves to be told completely and with respect for the tragedy it represents. They were not just plot devices or game mechanics, but characters whose deaths mattered, whose continued existence as spirits shaped everything that followed, whose eventual release represented a kind of victory hard won across decades of supernatural struggle. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of the darkest corners of gaming lore. If you enjoyed this comprehensive exploration of the missing children incident, if it helped you understand the Five Nights at Freddy's story more completely, or if it simply kept you company during late hours when sleep seemed distant, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more content like this. Let me know in the comments what aspects of FNAF lore you'd like to see explored next, what questions you still have, what theories you're working through. This community thrives on shared exploration of these complex narratives, on the collective effort to understand what Scott Cawthon created, on the discussions and debates that emerge when we all engage seriously with stories that deserve serious attention. The missing children incident happened on June 26, 1985. 5 children died. Their spirits lingered, and justice was delayed but eventually delivered. Their names are remembered, and their story continues to resonate with anyone who engages with Five Nights at Freddy's, a reminder that beneath the jump scares and supernatural horror lies genuine tragedy, human evil, and the complicated process of achieving peace when violence has shattered innocence beyond repair. Rest in peace, Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy. Your story has been told.